A new report from the Buckeye Environmental Network says a Washington County injection well is still leaking waste into nearby oil and gas wells, 6 years after the problem was first discovered. Our Chase Campbell has more.
A new report and a news conference this week in Washington County are raising fresh alarm about brine waste migrating from the Redbird No. 4 injection well, 6 years after the state first identified the problem. The Redbird No. 4 well has been injecting fracking wastewater since 2018. About a year later, nearby owners of conventional wells said their wells suddenly flooded with fluid and doesn't stop producing. A 2020 state investigation confirmed that wastewater from Redbird No. 4 had moved into the Berea Formation, contaminating wells more than 5 miles away. Now, well owners say the problems have persisted, and they're getting worse. Pressure readings in 3 nearby production wells have climbed sharply since 2023, in one case by more than 1,800%, a sign the report says points to brine waste migrating underground. Bob Wilson owns Wilson Energy. He says the damage to his wells and his business can't be undone.
My wells can't be repaired. The damage they've done to Washington County can't be repaired. And I told an inspector the other day, I said, you know, you could shut every injection well in Washington County down today. My business is still ruined.
Marietta College geologist David Jeffrey has studied the area's rock formations for more than 2 decades. He says the deep layers where the waste is injected have very little space to hold it.
They just think that they can inject an infinite amount of fluids. Where does it end? And it's clearly not working.
Jeffrey says the region's geology has been fractured repeatedly by mountain-building events going back hundreds of millions of years. Those fractures, he says, give the injected waste a path upward, because underground fluids move from high pressure to low pressure, and because decades of oil and gas production have already lowered pressure in the shallower Berea Formation. Jeffrey says the waste is essentially pulled upward into the wells still producing oil and gas today. He worries the same process could draw the brine waste, which is radioactive and contains PFAS chemicals, into drinking water aquifers.
We have a serious environmental problem here, and it's clear that it's expanding as we're speaking here.
For well owner Bob Lane, the concern goes beyond his business.
I got 2 great-grandchildren now, under the age of 3 years old, and every time I look in their face, I think of this. What are we leaving you?
According to Buckeye Environmental Network, 8 of the 17 injection wells in Washington County have had serious problems, including well blowouts and confirmed migration. The group says state inspection records for the impacted wells are inconsistent. One set of wells went uninspected for 2 full years, with only a single check-in in 2023 and none in 2024. Organizer Bev Reed says the state needs to investigate how far the contamination has spread.
They really need to do that massive investigation to see how far is the migration traveling to. They have they should have the resources to do this, and they're just not doing it.
The group is calling on the Ohio Department of Natural Resources to suspend injection operations near Redbird No. 4, launch a long-term investigation across southeast Ohio, and test private drinking water wells within 5 miles of injection wells with a history of migration. The issue has also raised concerns from local officials, with numerous municipalities and water utilities calling for an investigation and a moratorium on injection wells last year. Marietta Mayor Josh Schlicker and City Council President Susan Vessels hand-delivered their resolution calling for a moratorium to the State House and the governor's office. Vessels, who was at the news conference Tuesday, said that since then it's been, quote, radio silence from Columbus, unquote. We reached out to ODNR for comment and have not yet received a response. In Washington County, Chase Campbell, WTAP News.